Hello, everyone. This is the first of two introductory videos for our course, Philosophy 223 Perspectives on Death. This is the more important, I think, of the introductory videos because I'll actually be talking about what we'll be reading and some of the issues that we'll be discussing. The second is a video you'll find is just helping you to navigate around the Canvas site and making sure that we're all clear about what the actual requirements are for the course. So this is a thematic introduction to the course, and what you'll see is that the course has 5 parts. Part 1, Epicureanism and its puzzles. Part 2, the meaning of mortality. Part 3, Immortality and Life After Death. Part 4, After Immortality, the Book of Life. And Part 5, The Dead. So you'll see that there'll be an essay that's due after each one of these parts, because these readings that are grouped into different parts go together and pursue common questions and themes. We start out our course with a very, very important reading of Epicurus, Epicurus's letter to Monoikes. When I say Epicureanism there, and the Epicureanism and its puzzles, suppose I mean something very specific in terms of Epicurus's views on death. And one is that one part of Epicureanism with regard to death is that it is the absolute and permanent end of the person. The other really important thing to keep in mind in terms of Epicureanism with regard to death is that death is not part of life. Death being the absolute and permanent end of the person obviously means that for Epicurus, there's nothing like an afterlife. There's no immortality. Death is a kind of a limit that we reach, and that limit is irrevocable. Death is not a transition from one state of being to another. Death is the absolute end of our state of being. The other really important aspect of that is that death cannot be experienced because it's not part of life. It's the limit or end of life. So we'll be looking into these ideas, by reading Epicurus, but also in reading Thomas Nagel, his essay on death, and Bruckner and Fisher's Why is Death Bad? One of the implications of Epicureanism is that death is neither good or bad for the one who dies, because it doesn't have any value. And so the second and third readings here really take up the question, do we really believe, as Epicurus would say, that death isn't a bad thing for the one who dies? So the second and third articles or essays really attempt to refute Epicurus. Not these. They accept these aspects of Epicureanism. What they don't accept is this. And so really, after we're introduced to Epicurus's ideas on death, the real theme of part 1 of the course is whether or not death can be said to be a bad thing for the one who dies. Part 2 of the course, the meaning of mortality, opens things up considerably. After we actually read Epicurus and start looking at Nagel and Fisher, the questions are very narrow and specific, having to do with whether you can actually come up with a theory that death is really a bad thing for the one who dies, without falling into absurdity. It's a very narrow question. It's a very interesting question, but it's a very narrow question. And it's also true that if you accept the Epicurean view of death, that death is nothing, there's not a lot to say about death. Hans Jonas and Glenn Gray pretty much accept the Epicurean view of death, at least this part of it here, and would probably agree that there's not a lot you can say about death, but there's a lot you can say about mortality. And so the thing really opens up. And one of the things that, one of the distinctions that I really focus on in this part of the course is the distinction between death and mortality. They're two obviously very closely related concepts, death and mortality, but they are different. If Epicurus is right, we don't know what it is like to die. It doesn't even make any sense to say, I know what it's like to be dead. It's a logical absurdity. There's nothing that it's like. But we certainly know what it's like to be mortal, because to be mortal just means to be the kind of thing that will die. And we, as conscious creatures, human beings, we're aware of the fact that we are the kind of thing that will die. So all living things are mortal, but human beings are not only mortal, they know that they're mortal. So the burden and blessing of mortality and Gray's the idea of death and existentialism can be thought of as explorations of the ramifications of our consciousness of being the kind of creatures that can die at any moment and someday will die. No reason to get into the specifics of it, but it's obvious from Jonas's title that he believes that mortality is both a burden, a difficulty, and it's also a blessing, a good thing. And the essay is about him explaining why he thinks it's a burden and why he thinks it's also, in a different sense, a blessing. Gray's idea of death and existentialism is basically an essay written in the early 1950s for an American audience to explain the thought of two existentialist philosophers, Karl Jaspers and Martin Heidegger. Well, Gray's idea is that for Jaspers and Heidegger, death and mortality are at the very center of their philosophy, and this was a real departure for modern philosophy. So that being the kind of creature that knows that it is heading towards its own ultimate end is a central part of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a person. Part 3 of the course is deliberately placed. You'll see that it's called Immortality and Life After Death. The first 2 parts of the course pretty much take place in the conceptual space that is created by Epicurus and created by Epicureanism, at least these 2 parts of it. It's not until part 3 of the course that we get any philosopher who's willing to disagree with this first idea here, that death is the absolute and permanent end of the person. Both Plato and Paul Landsberg, Plato being the ancient Greek philosopher from 2,500 years ago, Paul Landsberg being a Christian philosopher of the 20th century, both in very different ways believe that that death is a transition. You can think of the Epicurean idea of death as hitting a brick wall. There's nothing after it. It's just the end, limit. Whereas both Plato and Landsberg offer alternative views which allow for the continued existence of the person in some way after the death of the body. Plato, the Phaedo is a brilliant Platonic dialogue that is set on the day that Socrates drinks the poison in fulfillment of the death sentence that was given to him for corrupting the youth of Athens. And then they spend the last hours of Socrates' life discussing the prospects for the immortality of the soul. Paul Landsberg's Christian Catholic philosophy is really a explicit denial of of Epicurus, and especially this part, because if death is not part of life, you can't experience it. So um, Landsberg is directly trying to refute that by calling his essay "The Experience of Death," and is another, you might say, argument for the immortality of the soul, but a very different one, a very Christian one, and also a more modern one than the one offered in Plato. Part 4 I've entitled After Immortality, the Book of Life. And what I mean after immortality, philosophers, 20th century philosophers, Hartshorne and Hans Jonas again, sorry, not Hans Jonas, who believe that the traditional view of immortality that, let's say, that we get from Plato or we get from Christianity or Islam, other religious views, is untenable, but that there is another sense of immortality, another sense of eternal existence. Jonas also offers in Immortality in the Modern Temper an alternative to the full-blown commitment to immortality that Plato and Landsberg have, a much reduced one, and both of them use the metaphor of the book of life. That is, that Hartshorne believes that we continue to have an existence, but only insofar as the record of our lives is a permanent part of reality. And Jonas has a similar idea in Immortality in the Modern Temper with important differences. So it's a kind of I would say, a more moderate, scaled down idea of immortality than the one that we get in the ones that we get in these two readings. Finally, part 5 of the course, The Dead, is really about how we view those who have died and the experience of grief. Donald Gustafson gives us an academic, philosophical, technical account of the experience of grief, an attempt to define grief in the proper way, which is incredibly interesting, but very academic. Whereas the great novelist and Christian writer C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed is simply his diaries that he kept in the weeks after the death of his wife. But as we'll find, there are some very interesting points of contact between Gustafson's academic account of grief and Lewis's personal account of grief. And finally, one of my favorites, Walter Schultz, 20th century philosopher, The Problem of Death, in which, yes, he talks about how we conceive of the dead, but he also, in a certain way, gives us a way of, a particularly modern way, of conceiving of our own relationship with death, what death is, and the big idea in Schultz is the idea of the transitory, that the particularly modern consciousness of our lives and existence and the life and existence of all living things is how transitory everything is. And that this is a way that human beings really have a universal sympathy for each other. So those are the kinds of things. That's a basic outline, philosophical or conceptual outline of the course. It is philosophical in nature. It's not a clinical course on how we would care for the dead, make end-of-life decisions. There's nothing about healthcare in here, really. It's not about hospice care or how we would counsel people who are dying or how we would counsel people who are grieving. It is a philosophical course. It goes into the root issues concerning death. And we're asking what death is, and we're asking whether we can really have any rational basis for thinking that there might be life after death. We're asking about what it means to be the kind of creature that knows that it can die at any moment and that eventually it definitely will die. We're looking at how we view ourselves, our own limited finite existence in the big picture of reality in the universe, and we're looking at how we actually respond to the deaths of others. I mean, I would say that these are very, very basic, really interesting to me root issues having to do with the philosophy of death.